On January 16, 2026, in the gilded corridors of a Beijing state building, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney shook hands with Chinese officials and signed what his government called a strategic partnership. That handshake cost 49,000 electric vehicles, a rewritten canola tariff schedule, and the beginning of a geopolitical rupture that Washington did not see coming. And here is what nobody on cable news is telling you about what happened next. That single handshake did not just anger one man with a social media account, it triggered a chain of events that is now reshaping the architecture of North American trade, threatening a $1.93 trillion agreement, and forcing global markets to reprice the stability of an economic bloc that has been the bedrock of the world's largest trading relationship for over 3 decades. This is not a diplomatic spat, this is the fracturing of the post-Cold War North American order in real time. Buckle up, let me explain what actually happened here, because the mainstream framing has been almost entirely wrong. The White House and its allies immediately declared that Canada had broken a trade agreement. That framing exploded across conservative media, financial desks, and international wire services within hours. Canada violated CUSMA. Canada chose China over America. Canada betrayed the alliance. Every one of those assertions requires a receipt, and when you read the receipt, what you find is something far more complicated and far more dangerous than a simple rules violation. What you find is a country that made a precise, surgical, and deliberately provocative calculation, and executed it with the cold precision of a former central banker who has spent his career watching what happens when you let a counterparty believe you have no alternatives. Here is the real connection that nobody is talking about. On January 16, 2026, Prime Minister Carney announced what his government described as a landmark trade deal with China, one that would open Canada's market to Chinese electric vehicles in exchange for lower tariffs on Canadian canola oil. On its face, that sounds like a modest agricultural and automotive exchange between two trading partners ironing out old grievances. That is the surface reading. That is the reading Washington chose publicly. Here is the deeper reading. In 2024, Canada had mirrored the United States by imposing a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles and a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. China had retaliated by imposing 100% import taxes on Canadian canola oil and meal and 25% tariffs on pork and seafood. Canada's farmers, Canada's agriculture sector, Canada's rural economy, all of them had been absorbing that pain for over a year, not because of anything Canada did, because Washington demanded alignment and Ottawa complied. Then Washington turned around and hit Canada with 25% tariffs anyway. Steel, aluminum, lumber, autos, sector by sector. The administration that demanded Canada's loyalty proceeded to treat Canada like a manufacturing adversary. The Trump administration's wrecking ball approach to traditional forms of international cooperation, its willingness to attack longtime partners and allies with ever more outrageous tariff threats, and its destruction of the US EV supply chain forced Canada to change its strategy for modernizing and growing its domestic auto industry. That is not a partisan assessment. That is the analysis of economists and trade specialists who spent the previous year watching Canada absorb blow after blow without a proportionate response. Carney's Beijing deal was the proportionate response. Precise, targeted, calibrated. Canada and China agreed to lower tariffs on Canadian canola oil from 84% to approximately 15% by March 1, 2026, in exchange for Canada lowering the tariff rate on Chinese EVs from 100% to 6.1% on the first 49,000 vehicles, eventually growing to 70,000 over 5 years, 49,000 vehicles. And let that number sink in for a moment. The initial cap on Chinese EV imports represented about 3% of the 1.8 million vehicles sold in Canada annually. 3%. The White House declared a national emergency over 3% of the Canadian auto market. And that declaration told the world something important. It told the world that Washington understood exactly what Carney was doing. Because this was never about the vehicles. This was about leverage. Brian Clough, who led Canada-US relations as Deputy Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, said the US reaction to the deal demonstrated precisely where the leverage came from. What the deal ultimately says to the Americans is, if you keep treating us badly, if you keep slapping tariffs on our key sectors like steel, aluminum, cars, lumber, If you refuse to renew the CUSMA deal, you're going to push Canada further into the arms of China. That is not a threat, that is an equation. And Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, knows exactly how to write an equation. Now let us talk about Washington's response, because this is where the story accelerates. Trump issued a statement on Truth Social warning that if Carney thinks he is going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken. If Canada makes a deal with China, the Post read, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the USA, 100% on all Canadian goods. That is not a tariff, that is economic annihilation. Canada exports approximately 800 billion Canadian dollars of goods across the American border annually. More than 76% of Canada's worldwide exports go to the United States. A 100% tariff on that volume is not leverage. It is a threat to end Canada as a functioning export economy, and the global market knew it. Here is what the administration did not anticipate. Canada did not fold. Carney pushed back directly, saying Canada has no intention of pursuing a free trade agreement with China or any other non-market economy, and described the Beijing agreement as simply rectifying tariff issues that had developed in the last couple of years. He did not apologize. He did not reverse the deal. He did not summon his ambassador to offer private reassurances. He stood in front of cameras and said, "We did this, and it is entirely consistent with our obligations, and we are not undoing it." That is the response of a man who came to the table prepared. And here is the detail that makes this extraordinary. Carney was correct on the legal merits. Trade policy experts confirmed that Canada did not break any trade agreements. Rather, it was the United States that had been violating the spirit, if not the letter, of CUSMA. The U.S. administration wanted Canadians to believe they broke a trade agreement so Canada could be punished ahead of the CUSMA renegotiation. Under Article 32.10 of CUSMA, Canada would only trigger notification obligations if it were negotiating a full free trade agreement with a non-market economy like China. The newly announced strategic partnership with China did not constitute such an agreement, and Prime Minister Carney confirmed Canada had no intention of negotiating a free trade deal with China at this time. The legal architecture did not support Washington's argument. The 100% tariff threat was not a legal response to a legal violation. It was a political weapon aimed at a country that had just demonstrated it could play at a different table. Let me explain the mechanics of why this terrifies markets, because the financial fallout goes far deeper than canola oil and electric vehicles. On July 1, 2026, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement is up for its mandatory 6-year review. All three parties must agree to extend the deal for another 16 years, or risk entering annual renewal cycles that could inject permanent uncertainty into the markets. Annual renewal cycles. And think about what that means for a company with a 10-year capital plan, a factory that straddles the Michigan-Ontario border, a supply chain that moves auto parts across 3 countries 14 times before they reach final assembly. The USMCA represents a market of over 500 million people, accounting for 30% of global GDP. In 2024, goods and services trade within North America totaled an estimated $1.93 trillion. $1.93 trillion. That is the number that is now sitting on a table in Washington, Ottawa, and Mexico City. And nobody in any of those capitals has a map of how to protect it. Prime Minister Carney stood before the country on March 5, 2026, and declared that CUSMA had been effectively broken in the short term by U.S. actions. That is an extraordinary statement from a sitting Prime Minister about Canada's most important trade relationship. Effectively broken, not strained, not under pressure, broken. When a former central banker uses the word broken to describe the foundational document of North American commerce, the bond markets hear that word, the currency desks hear that word, the institutional investors running pension funds with exposure to Canadian and American manufacturing hear that word, and they adjust. Now, the domino chain. Here is what the secondary effects look like on the ground, and this is the part that cable news is not showing you. The economic effects of the trade deal uncertainty are pronounced in locations like Windsor, Ontario, a city with deep economic ties to the United States. The broader national economy saw a contraction in the final quarter of last year. A co-owner of a local Windsor sign business described the current moment as the toughest period since the pandemic, with clients reducing orders and demanding extended payment terms due to uncertainty surrounding the 2026 CUSMA review. A sign company in Windsor, think about the cascade that represents. When a sign company is cutting orders, it means the manufacturers they serve are cutting orders. When the manufacturers cut orders, the parts suppliers cut orders. When the parts suppliers cut orders, the workers in those facilities face reduced hours, layoffs, and the slow erosion of a middle class that was built on the promise of integrated North American production. Under the current tariff structure, Canada faces 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum, in 25% tariffs on autos and trucks and their parts, 10% tariffs on softwood, lumber, and timber, and 25% tariffs on certain semiconductors. And those are just the sectoral tariffs that survived the U.S. Supreme Court's intervention. In February 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the president cannot use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose tariffs. The court struck down the legal architecture underpinning Trump's broadest tariff authority. What did the administration do within days? It removed the IEEPA tariffs and replaced them with a global 10% tariff under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, effective February 24, 2026. The Supreme Court closed one door, the White House opened another. The math is merciless, and here is the worst case. Here is the ceiling. According to Scotiabank Economic Research, the July 2026 CUSMA review represents the single most consequential macro uncertainty facing the Canadian economy this year. A failure to reach agreement could push Canada toward recession. Recession in a G7 economy with a population of 40 million people, because one administration decided that tariffs were the primary instrument of foreign policy, because one former real estate developer from 1980s Manhattan is applying the logic of a hostile acquisition to the management of a $2 trillion integrated continental economy. The scalpel became a sledgehammer, and the collateral damage is accruing by the hour. But this is where the analysis gets genuinely complicated. Let us talk about what Canada actually sees from its side of the table. Because the Carney government is not operating in panic. It is operating with deliberate strategic purpose. And that deliberateness should concern Washington more than any retaliatory tariff. In 2025, Canada signed a new trade agreement with Indonesia, relaunched trade negotiations with India, launched negotiations with the United Arab Emirates, opened consultations on negotiations with the Mercosur bloc, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay, and announced intentions to enter negotiations with Thailand, Indonesia, India, the UAE, the Mercosur bloc. These are not backup plans. These are the systematic construction of an alternative architecture, a diversified portfolio, as one Canadian professor of international affairs described it, that reduces the vulnerability to shocks from any single partner. Capital has no patriotism. Neither, it turns out, does trade policy. In 2026, Canadian autonomy is increasingly defined not as distance from the United States, but as resilience within interdependence. The USMCA is central to that resilience, not only as a trade agreement, but as an institutional framework through which Canada and Mexico seek predictability in their economic relationship with Washington. That framing matters. Carney is not trying to leave the North American table. He is trying to ensure that Canada arrives at that table with enough alternatives that it cannot be bullied away from it. Here is the historical parallel, and pay attention to this one. When British manufacturing began relocating to the American colonies in the late 18th century, Parliament tried tariffs, restrictions, and outright prohibitions on the export of machinery and skilled workers to prevent the transfer of industrial knowledge. It did not work. The capital moved anyway. The expertise moved anyway. The gravitational pull of new markets, new relationships, and new terms of engagement proved stronger than any legislative wall Parliament could construct. 250 years later, a different Parliament, the one in Ottawa, is watching a different great power try to use tariffs to constrain its strategic choices. The historical outcome of that approach should be instructive. Now let us talk about the political fallout, because there are cracks forming that go beyond economics. Trump's threat of a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods came after the administration learned of Canada's agreement with China on EVs and agriculture. This was another reminder that tariffs are the primary coercive tool of this administration, regardless of the existence of trade agreements. That phrase is the key. CUSMA is a legally binding document negotiated by the United States, ratified by Congress, signed into law. It contains explicit obligations. The administration's willingness to threaten actions that contradict that document, not quietly, not through legal channels, but publicly, on social media, in statements to the press, is what is actually fracturing the credibility of American commitments in the global system. Not Carney, not Beijing, Washington. As of the end of March 2026, Canada and the United States have engaged only in preliminary informal talks regarding the CUSMA review. While Mexico has already commenced formal discussions with Washington with a target completion date set for early July, Mexico is at the table, Canada is in the lobby. That asymmetry tells you something important about the state of the relationship. The administration that accused Canada of breaking agreements is simultaneously running a faster-track negotiation with Mexico. The signal to Ottawa is unmistakable, and Carney is reading it clearly. Republican members of Congress will grow increasingly sensitive to how tariffs could hurt their re-election prospects as the midterms approach. As one senior Canadian trade official observed, the Americans are going to start to say this really is not working to our advantage, because affordability has become a big issue. Affordability, that is the word that ends tariff wars, not diplomacy. Not legal rulings, not strategic arguments about supply chain integration, affordability. The moment American consumers feel the price of the tariffs in their grocery bills, their car payments, their construction costs, that is when the political calculus changes. And given that Canada is the United States' largest supplier of both steel and aluminum, and more than $2.5 billion in goods and services crosses the Canada-US border each day, that moment is not distant. Watch for three things. First, the CUSMA review in July 2026. This is the single most consequential near-term event in the North American economic calendar. All three parties must make a choice: extend for 16 years, withdraw, or enter an annual review cycle that keeps every business, every investor, and every supply chain in permanent uncertainty. Watch whether Canada and Mexico arrive at that table together. Watch whether Washington attempts to negotiate bilateral terms that split Ottawa and Mexico City. A divided North American front is Washington's best outcome. A united one is Carney's. Second, the canola tariff timeline. Beijing committed to lowering its tariff on Canadian canola seed to approximately 15% by March 1, 2026. That is a concrete, measurable, time-stamped commitment. If that number holds, and the grain markets are watching closely, it validates Carney's entire strategic thesis, that Canada can build credible alternatives. That the Beijing deal was not a gesture, but a functional trade arrangement with real consequences for Canadian farmers in Saskatchewan and Alberta. If it does not hold, Washington will argue it was always theater. Watch the canola price in Winnipeg. Third, the Section 301 investigations the U.S. Trade Representative has now launched against Canada under a new legal authority. In parallel to the CUSMA review, Canada and the United States are engaged in tariff negotiations, and the U.S. Trade Representative has now launched new investigations under Section 301 that include Canada. Section 301 is the same authority the United States used to justify hundreds of billions in tariffs against China during the first trade war. It was designed for adversaries. The fact that it is now being pointed at Canada, the country that buys more American goods than the United Kingdom, France, China, and Japan combined, that is the signal. Watch what those investigations target. Watch whether they are used as leverage ahead of July, or whether they are fired as a weapon before negotiations even begin. Here is what this moment actually is. This is not a trade dispute. Trade disputes have resolution mechanisms, legal frameworks, arbitration panels, and institutional precedents. This is the stress test of whether the rules-based international order that the United States spent the post-war era constructing can survive the United States itself. CUSMA is not just a tariff schedule. It is a statement that sovereign nations can bind themselves to predictable rules, that commerce can be organized around law rather than power, that a smaller economy adjacent to a larger one has legal protections against the arbitrary exercise of that larger economy's muscle. The moment those protections become negotiable based on the mood of a man with a social media account, they are no longer protections, they are suggestions. Carney understood that before he got on the plane to Beijing. He understood that the only way to preserve the value of those protections was to demonstrate that Canada had credible alternatives to the relationship in which they were embedded, not to abandon the relationship, to make it cost something, to degrade it. The empire does not always fall to invaders. Sometimes it simply signs deals with the people it told its allies not to talk to, and then tells those allies to get in line. The global economy has entered its weakest 3-year stretch in decades. As U.S. policy shifts reverberate worldwide, trade tensions persist, and political uncertainty clouds once stable markets. That is not a Canadian assessment. That is Export Development Canada's assessment. That is the assessment of the economists and credit analysts who spend their careers stress-testing the assumptions underneath the global trading system. The math is merciless, and the math says that $1.93 trillion in integrated North American trade cannot survive permanent political instability at its center. Canada just demonstrated that it is willing to introduce that instability rather than absorb it indefinitely. That is the real agreement that just broke. Not CUSMA, not the China deal. The unspoken agreement that Canada would always need America more than America needed Canada. That agreement broken in Beijing on January 16th, 2026. Subscribe. Stay tuned. History is moving fast. Make sure you're watching, because the geography of North American power is being redrawn in real time, and nobody in Washington has a map